We're back for an episode of This is Melbourne, where we discuss the predicaments and triumphs of our city. I'm your host, Jamison Salter.
And I'm Jacklyn Yeong. Today we'll be discussing Melbourne's population growth since it's recently reached 5 million people.
That's risen by over 125,000 in the past year. Have you noticed the increase, Jacklyn?
I've definitely seen drastic changes from when I first came to Australia to study in 2015. I can't believe it's actually predicted to overtake Sydney as the largest city.
Yeah, many people are even saying it will be similar to the size of New York by 2050 at like 8 million people. Although there is someone who's noticed that it's an unfair comparison, right?
Yep, and I think we read the article together. His name is Glenn Capriano. In his article, he wrote that the age comparing Melbourne to New York City was a less useful comparison because he said that Melbourne is not at New York levels yet, but it's interesting to see that population growth is now a topic in many people's radars.
Yeah, and I think even though the increase might not be as big as we think, the city is definitely showing signs of the growth. We recently lost our title of the world's most livable city after 7 consecutive years.
The survey analyzes livability judged on healthcare, infrastructure, education, and stability, culture, and environment. So Melbourne got perfect scores for the first 3, but still lost to Vienna because they lowered crime rates.
Yeah, but Vienna has significantly smaller population though. So in the scheme of things, Melbourne is doing quite well. Do you know the ranking of the city?
I think it goes by Vienna, Melbourne, Osaka, Calgary, and Sydney. I think they're all very close to each other with about a point difference.
Yeah, it's so close.
And I also did a kind of like a vox pop thing about what do people think Vienna taking over Melbourne as the most livable city, and some people actually did not know that it actually happened. They still think that Melbourne is the most livable city in the world.
I found that a lot of people are surprised. And I think one of the main reasons we lost our livability title is because of the increase in Australia's population.
Yeah, almost 65% of the increase in the population is from migrants.
Yeah, and I recently heard that there's a big push to get these migrants to move to regional areas of Australia, like Shepparton and Bendigo, to lessen labour shortages and minimise the density in the city. The Morrison government has even suggested a plan to settle migrants outside capital cities for 5 years, letting them choose to stay or leave after that period of time. What do you think about that?
I think it's an issue that the government has to tread carefully on because and I think that any updates on the population package are still probably in discussion because Scott Morrison just got elected as Prime Minister, so I'm sure they're still working on the proposal. And there was an article about this particular issue, and Mary Patezos from the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, she told AAP that immigrants are critical to Australia's economy and society because they care for our elderly and disabled, and some of them support our nation's agriculture sector and Australia's growing IT and high-tech companies as well. So she talked about any policies that encourage migration to the regions need to be transparent and fair to protect migrants from any exploitation, which I think is a really fair point.
Yeah, definitely.
There's also another person who, mentioned in the article, Carla Wilshire from the Migration Council of Australia. She said it is very critical to have necessary social infrastructure invested into these regional locations. I think she brought up a pretty important point of some temporary workers settling in metropolitan areas because they have specific skills or qualifications that are vital to building the economy of the future.
Now we have an interview with Catherine Betts, who is the Vice President of the Australian Population Research Institute and an Associate Professor of Sociology at Swinburne University. She is also a co-contributor to a research report conducted by TAPRI about Australia's voters' views on immigration policy that we thought would be an interesting take in our topic.
Mm-hmm. And the reason why we thought it would be interesting to include the findings from the TAFRA report, because it contradicts the Dscribe report recently published by, not recently, but 2016. It was published in 2016 by Andrew Marcus from Monash University, and also the most recent 2018 Shaping a Nation report published by Fairfax Media just recently.
Let's give her a call now.
Thank you for joining us, Catherine.
So, politicians have argued that Australia has less, what they call left behind people since the global financial crisis. Which is why we're more accepting of migrants than other countries. But who do you think is really accepting of migrants, also in the political sphere as well as just Australian citizens?
Well, the argument about, why people voted for Donald Trump in America and why they voted for Brexit did hinge quite a lot on this idea of the left behind. And I think there's quite a bit in it. But it's often not the poorest of the poor who are angry. It's people who are middling, the people that Margaret Thatcher says are just managing. And if you look at the statistics on wage growth in the United States and in Britain, it's been really, really flat for a very long time. But we had the resources boom, and wage growth is not all that good right now, but it's nowhere near as bad as in it's nowhere near as flat, low and horrible as it has been in the United States and Britain. What we did find, we first of all, we asked a question about, do you think the numbers of immigrants coming to Australia should be increased, kept the same or decreased, which is the one that we've been talking about. But after a few more questions, we gave them some information, because people are very ill-informed. We said Australia's population has been growing rapidly. 62% of this growth is due to net overseas migration. Do you think Australia needs more people? And 74% said no. So once they had a bit more information and were asked about population growth rather than immigration, they came out very strongly, no, they didn't want more people. That's very few surveys do you get 74% saying one thing.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think that they think that migration is causing a strain on resources and their quality of life? Yes.
We had a number of questions about, who do you think gains from all this, and big business and property developers came out strongly as groups they thought were gaining from it. So there weren't very many positives that people were finding in it. Now, that's not to say that we run policy according to public opinion, but it's something to take into account. And we were able to use the Australian election survey that was done after the 2016 election, because that had responses from candidates, from people who run for Parliament, as well as voters. And that's where we found that amongst all candidates, they were almost universally in favour of not just immigration staying as it was, but of it being increased even further. They were light years away from where voters were, and that was back in 2016.
The recent Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, he suggested a plan to actually settle migrants outside of capital cities for 5 years. Well, do you think that's a good plan?
No, it's a way of trying to get off the hook. Back in 2010, when we had the big Australia debate, I think in 2009, Mr. Rudd had said on television that he personally favoured the big Australia. I can't document this, but I think he was rather rude to some girl in the audience who questioned him. And suddenly there was an outbreak of people writing to the editor and so forth and saying, what's all this about? So when Julia Gillard took over, she set up an inquiry. And she said we shouldn't go hurtling on to 30 or 50 million without thinking about it. Let's pause. And so there was an inquiry. I was in fact asked to be involved in it. I was on the environment panel. There was a demography panel, an environment panel, and the business panel. The business panel said, well, it's fine, but the demography panel had reservations and the environment panel certainly had. But at the end, the solution was, we'll send the migrants to the regions. Now, that was 2010. Has it happened? No. If people have got a permanent visa, they can live where they like in Australia. You can't force them to stay in Darwin because that's where the plane landed. And I don't see how it can be done with permanent migrants. You might be able to do something tricky with temporary ones, saying they can only get a visa if they promise to live in a certain place. But they come for work or they come to study. So they come to Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, where all these things are happening.
Yeah. And also, you found that much older voters are more concerned about these issues than younger graduates. Why is that?
That's an interesting finding. I think that part of it is that older people can remember Australia as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and in many ways think that was a better place where their kids could afford to buy a house, where you could drive from A to B without it being dreadful, where there wasn't this awful competition, where kids, were trying to get into selective high schools and thinking that their whole careers will rest on whether this matters, on whether they achieve this goal or not, so that older people like myself can look back to a time that felt less pressured than today, whereas younger people, this is all they've known. And also, quite rightly, there's a lot of teaching in the schools and the universities about tolerance and respecting diversity and immigration being a good thing, as indeed, of course, in many, many ways it has been. It's just, you can have too much ice cream, can't you? It doesn't mean that it's all bad. So, yes, it is interesting that young people who are bearing the brunt of this, because they're the ones who can't get into the housing market, and they're the ones who compete for decent jobs, which are becoming, rarer and rarer, yet they're not seeing it. I mean, a lot of them are seeing it as a problem, but not in the same proportion as older people.
Well, we really appreciate you speaking with us today. I think that's all the questions we had, Paul.
Okay, nice to talk to you both.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And that was Catherine Betts speaking with us about Australia's view on population growth. And so as a migrant yourself, Jacklyn, what do you think of all this? How has your experience in Melbourne been?
I love it here, and I don't want to leave. Even though Melbourne lost to Vienna as the most livable city in the world, which is not, I'm sorry, Vienna, but not really obvious to some of our population. They still think that it's the most livable city. But being able to stay here would definitely be a wonderful opportunity for me to build a good life and expand my career as a journalist. But I also think that it's one of the contributing reasons to the population increase in Australia, because I don't want to leave. I think it's a term said not only by myself but my other peers as well who's graduating or migrating here, and that in my opinion creates a huge worrying competition for international graduates and local graduates, not only to apply for a job, and for us immigrants to apply for permanent resident status as well. And Tim Kobach, he's a former economics editor for The Age. He wrote a piece on immigration called "Yes, There's Such a Thing as Too Much Immigration," which is a very critical piece on Australian migration, particularly the 457 visa program, which is now abolished by the Turnbull government. And the visa program was the most common visa for Australian or overseas employers to support and sponsor skilled overseas workers to work temporarily in Australia. And it had it had relatively little oversight by the government that led to workers easily converting their visas into permanent residency. So abolishing the visa is definitely going to be a disadvantage for recent international graduates trying to settle down in Australia, including myself.
It's definitely going to be a lot harder for them.
Yeah, it was hard, and now it's harder.
Yeah, more. So now we're going to go talk to Martin North, the principal of Digital Finance Analytics, to see what he thinks of Australia's intake of migrants on housing.
Yeah, his expertise is housing and property values.
Yeah.
Yep, so we're going to call him now. Hi, Martin. Thanks for joining us in our podcast.
Great to talk to you.
So we wanted to ask you if the rising population in Victoria is contributing to the property values.
Population is one factor, not the biggest. It's credit.
Is the increase in the cost of living, could that be attributed to the increase in population at all, or maybe not?
Well, the cost of living are driven by a whole bunch of things. So you think about electricity. Right? Electricity costs are very high. They've been rising significantly. That's partly because of the significant investment in coal and wire. But also, of course, it's having to meet the demands of more people needing power, and that means that the supply side needs to have investments put into it. Now, of course, there are a bunch of policies behind that which probably also call it out, but nevertheless, more people means you need more power generation, and that actually means more investment. That flows directly into the costs. I guess the same is also true for healthcare and childcare costs. In other words, bigger population means there's more demand for those services. That means that more of them need to be invested in. And so, yeah, there is an indirect correlation, I think, between some of those cost of living factors and the general cost of living. The other side of the coin, though, is that if population growth is rising, that may mean that there are more people willing and able to work, and that can put downward pressure potentially on incomes as well. So there is an argument to suggest perhaps that greater population leads to rising costs and compressed income, which of course is a bad outlook.
Also, there's a 65% of migrants included in the rising population. And do you think that that's a big factor in contributing to the property values in Victoria because they are more capable in buying?
Yeah, so there is how can I put this politely? There's a view out there that is blaming strong migration growth for the fact that property prices have risen so strongly. I personally think that is a wrong connection to make, and it's an easy connection to make because it looks like it's a simple problem, therefore a simple solution. The truth is, it's a much more complicated set of issues going on here. As I said earlier on, migration has a small impact, and some of those people coming in have assets to bring, cash in their pockets, as it were, to buy, and that clearly does have some impact, but it's a very minor impact on all the modelling that I've seen, and the modelling I've done suggests that this is really quite a small factor in the scheme of things. However, it's a highly politically charged factor, and so what you find is that some vocal advocates of tightening migration use the prospective connection between that and property prices to try and argue for tying back migration. My own view is that's a very weak argument, but it's one that unfortunately is being used more. Personally, I think that if we have the right strategies around planning, around infrastructure, and we have the right forward-looking views as to how to build for the future, then there's absolutely no problem with migration. The issue is, if we don't do any of that, and just hope that it will fly, we don't make the plans for the future, that's when the problems start. But I don't honestly think that migration should be blamed directly for significant impacts on home prices or indeed on the economic results.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for joining
our
us.
podcast.
Great to talk to you.
Thank you for your time.
Well, there was an interesting insight from Martin North, and I'm sure housing costs isn't the only issue, Jamie. What about the strain on public transport?
Yeah, there's definitely a strain. For Melbourne, I know a thing that they're trying to improve to accommodate for the rising population is the transport system. Like the new suburban loop was just announced, and that's a $50 billion plan to connect the southeastern suburbs to the airport. And then there's also the Metro Tunnel and the Northeast Link that's currently being built.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I can't believe that Melbourne still doesn't have an airport connection by trains or trams.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Can you also believe that we're the only continent without a high-speed rail?
Wow. Yeah, these upgrades are an important step into maximising our city's capabilities for the future, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for tuning in to our podcast where we discussed Melbourne's rising population with two special guests.
This has been Jamison and Jacklyn on This is Melbourne. Until next time.